from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
About 20 years ago, a group of Christian families from Indonesia who were facing religious persecution fled their homeland and came here to the United States, where they applied for refugee status. In the Muslim majority country of Indonesia, Christians often face discrimination and even violent persecution for their beliefs. These refugees settled here in the seacoast area of New Hampshire, down in the Dover and Rochester area, and for the last 20 years, they've been building up their lives. They've been raising families and holding down jobs, starting businesses and churches. And of course, many of these refugees have now had children and even grandchildren who are full citizens of the United States. And this community has certainly enjoyed the prosperity and the religious freedom for which our nation is justly proud. But over the last few months, something has changed. Many of these Indonesian refugees going to immigration offices where they've routinely gone for the last 20 years to check in have now been told that they are going to be deported, that they must leave behind their families and lives and churches and community here in the United States and go back to Indonesia, where they no longer have a family or a livelihood, and where religious persecution of Christians has only grown worse in the last 20 years. Many of them were told to come back to immigration offices within a week with airplane tickets in hand to prove that they were leaving the country. Now, to their credit, almost every elected official, newspaper, religious leader in New Hampshire has protested this needlessly cruel exercise in authority. And there's still hope that these deportation orders are going to be reversed. But today, we need to add our voices to the cry for justice and compassion for the stranger in our midst. It's not easy being a stranger in a strange land, having a different culture and background, a different way of speaking, a different way of dressing. Last week, I went down to my college reunion at the Grapponi Center in Concord, and I ran down there after the Saturday night Mass with my collar on. I went to a little Catholic liberal arts college anyways, Thomas More College in Merrimack, and everyone knows I'm a priest. And so I walked into the Grapponi Center with my collar on, and there was this whole group of about 100 people there in the main hall, having drinks and just getting in line for dinner. And so I started mixing right in. Boy, I said to myself, I didn't realize there was this many people that went to my little college. And as I looked around, I realized, actually, I don't really know many people here. And then I saw a sign on one of the tables that said, "Welcome to the annual New Hampshire United Church of Christ Ministers Convention." And suddenly I realized everyone was staring at me, wondering why there was a Catholic priest in the middle of their ministers' convention. Well, I didn't think I was going to be asked to stay to say grace, so I quickly backed off and went down the hall where I found my college reunion in the much smaller hall. It's not easy being a stranger in a strange land. And today, in our scriptures, we hear about how to treat the stranger and the refugee. Do not oppress or molest an alien, for you yourselves were aliens once in the land of Egypt. How quickly we forget our history. The people of Israel had just settled in the promised land, and so God was giving them this law to share what they had been given with others. And they had forgotten that just a few short years before, they themselves had been refugees. They themselves had left slavery in Egypt, and God had led them through the desert to this promised land. God had given them so much. And so now God was asking them to share of the riches that they had. How quickly we forget our history as Catholics as well. We forget so often that our Catholic ancestors came here from France and Ireland and Italy and Germany, largely as refugees and as immigrants to our nation. We came here very often fleeing religious persecution in our own countries, and we came here to a country that was about as Protestant as the UCC convention at the Grapponi Center last Saturday. We were a religious minority, and we were often discriminated against and persecuted. We had to band together and help each other find jobs and start businesses. We had to defend our churches when crowds, angry mobs, whipped up by political parties like the Know Nothings and the Ku Klux Klan, who came to power by spouting hateful rhetoric against those Catholic foreigners and immigrants. We had to defend ourselves in some ways. And now most Christians, then and now, Catholic and Protestant alike, and in fact people of all faiths, just want to live in peace, just want to love their neighbor as themselves. But who is my neighbor? When someone asked Jesus that question, Jesus responded with the story of the Good Samaritan, of the hated foreigner who finds a Jewish person on the side of the road, waylaid by robbers, and shows him tremendous love and compassion. Shows compassion and mercy to someone who was considered a foreigner and an enemy. Indeed, Jesus reminds us, Jesus gives us the command today to love God and to love our neighbor, but he reminds us in the Sermon on the Mount that the true test of love is not whether we love the person who looks just like us, who lives right next door. Everyone does that. The true test of love is whether we love the person who is different than us, the person who comes from a faraway place, whether we love a person whom, in the world's eyes, we might consider an enemy. Now, don't get me wrong, don't get the church's teaching wrong. A nation has every right to protect its borders. A nation has every right to keep terrorists and enemies and criminals and drug dealers out. A country has every right to make laws that govern immigration. But those laws must be made in the spirit of love and compassion and generosity to those in need. Those laws must be made in a way that keeps together families and communities and doesn't tear them apart. Those laws must be made in the realization that taking in refugees is not an act of generosity, it's an act of justice. That we need to help those, especially when we live in a nation that is so blessed with all the material resources that we have far more than we could ever possibly use ourselves. And especially in the middle of the largest refugee crisis since World War II, in which millions of people around the world are now displaced because of wars in the Middle East and hunger in Africa, and because of an unjust distribution of resources around the world and environmental degradation. We are called to love all God's children and all those in need. And we are called to open up our hearts and our homes to all those who are looking for love. Here's what Pope Francis recently said. What do I think of countries that close their frontiers? I think that hearts must not be closed to refugees, but those who govern need prudence. They must be very open to receiving refugees, but they also have to calculate how best to settle them. Because refugees not only must be accepted, they must also be integrated. Consequently, if a country has, say, the ability to accept so many persons, they should do this. Another country that has greater capacity should do more, but always with an open heart. It is not human to close the door. It is not human to close the heart. Our Christian faith shows us that we are all in desperate need of God's love and mercy. We are all, because of sin, strangers to God's love. And God, in his great love and mercy, has opened up his home to us, has opened up his kingdom through the love and power of his Son, Jesus Christ. And that's why we must open up our hearts and our homes in compassion to those in need. That's why we must speak out against those who would once again vilify and close the door to the strangers in our midst. And we can ask ourselves, who is the stranger in our own lives? Who is that person who is in need of God's love, who is perhaps on the margins of our life, who is kind of on the outside of the in crowd that we belong to? How can we welcome them into the fullness of God's love? One day we want to hear the words of Jesus spoken to us at the Last Judgment. Come into my house. Come into my kingdom. For whatever you did to one of these least ones, you did to me. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me.